Airbnb versus long-term rental. That's the subject of this video. Welcome everyone, my name is Fernando David, and on this video, we're going to discuss the pros and cons versus long-term rentals and short-term rentals. All right, so let's go ahead and begin by discussing the pros of each. We'll start with long-term. One of the pros is the low entry point. Here's what I mean by that. When you purchase a long-term rental, it's much easier, or it's less costly than a short-term rental, because here you can get away, first of all, you don't have to furnish it, and then you can get away with buying durable but cheaper products, such as granite countertops you don't have to buy, expensive flooring you don't have to buy. So the entry point for long-term rental is lower. Number two is predictable income. Here's what I mean by that. You're going to set the income or the rents that are going to be coming in. And as long as your tenant is paying, it's going to be predictable, right? You're going to know exactly what's going to come in month to month. So that's a pro. And last is less management. A long-term rental, again, if you get the right tenant in place, and if the property doesn't require a lot of maintenance and repairs, it's really passive, because you're going to leave it there and you're just going to collect rent month to month unless something happens or the tenant calls you for some type of repair or some type of need. Then the management's going to be less. In addition to that, it's going to cost you less if you have to hire a management company. So that's the pros. Let's go ahead and move on to the short-term pros. The first and foremost, and the reason why a lot of investors go this route, is because you get a higher ROI, or higher return on investment. Everyone that knows anything about investing knows that you can probably get up to 3 times more in terms of revenue than you can in a long-term rental. So that's a pro. Number two, less wear and tear and more eyes on the property. Here's what I mean by that. In a long-term rental, you're going to have a tenant that's going to be living in the property every single day, right? Whereas in a short-term rental, you're going to have a guest that may only sleep on the property, because most people use short-term rentals they use them as vacations or when they go on vacations. So they're really not inside the property, right? They're outside visiting the city that they're going to visit. So less wear and tear. And what I mean by more eyes on the property is that your housekeepers, or you, whoever you're going to be going into the property, can actually go in there and on a regular basis see if there's any little minor repairs that you need to take care of immediately, so those minor repairs don't turn into big repairs. Versus in a long-term rental, guests or your tenant may not tell you that the sink is leaking. They may not do maintenance on the AC. So that is a pro. The next is the ability to use the property. That's a pro for a lot of people, because if you have an Airbnb or short-term rental in a seasonal area, or if you want to use it yourself, you can use it. Or if you're in a pinch, if you have to do some repairs to your property, you can go ahead and use your property. But the property is there for your use. That's a pro. Number 4, lower risk. And here's what I mean by that. As a short-term rental, the chances that your property gets damaged is actually less than in a long-term rental. In addition to that, and I mentioned this on other videos, you have more guarantees in a short-term rental. For example, Airbnb gives their host what's called the host guarantee and the host insurance protection program, right? Those are 2 programs that protect your property from damages or bad guests. So your risk is lower. In addition to that, your risk is lower in terms of revenue. Here's what I mean by that. In a long-term rental, if you happen to get a bad tenant, or even if the tenant is good, but that tenant falls on hard times and they don't pay you, that risk is huge, because now you're going to go month after month, or until you get them evicted, or until that person pays you to start receiving revenue. In a short-term rental, it's based on your occupancy. if you do your numbers right, you can probably be profitable at about 50% occupancy. And chances are, in most markets, especially in my market, you're never going to be that low, right? Even during the pandemic, we weren't that low. So the risk is lower. The last is, and I write the law favors you, and the law, what I mean is the landlord-tenant laws. In a short-term rental, you don't fall under the landlord-tenant laws. In Florida, the landlord-tenant laws favor the tenant, not the landlord. But in a short-term rental, you don't have that, because if you're a licensed short-term rental, you fall under the hotel motel licensing. So if you have an issue with a guest, you just call the cops and they kick them out, right? You don't need to go through the eviction process that you have to do in a long-term case if you have to evict your tenant. All right, so now let's talk about the cons, and we'll start with long terms. Here are the cons. I just mentioned evictions, right? Evictions are probably the landlord's worst nightmare, right? You don't want to go through eviction process because it takes time. In most cases, it may take up to 90 days to get someone evicted. In some cases, I've heard it's taking even longer than that, especially if it's contested. So evictions. The next con is the lower revenues. We already discussed this. Because in a short-term rental, your revenues are going to be less. Your risk is also higher, as I mentioned, because if you have one tenant versus in a short-term rental, you may have multiple guests coming in, so you're always going to have some kind of revenue coming in. But if that one tenant you have in that one property doesn't pay, you got zero coming in. So the risk is there. Number 3, there's definitely more wear and tear in a long-term rental than there is in a short-term rental. I can tell you, especially on the turnover cost, every time I've had it in my long-term properties, when a tenant left and I had to get that property rental ready for the next tenant, it always cost me anywhere between $8,000 and $10,000. We have to paint. If we have carpets, we either have to replace them or get them professionally cleaned. The time it takes to get a new tenant in, that time is money lost. So you're going to have more turnover costs in a long-term rental. Number 4, you don't have access to your property. You may, if you have this in your lease agreement, that you can conduct inspections, right? Maybe quarterly or bi-yearly, but you don't get to go into your property every day like you do in a short-term rental. So that is a con. And the last one, you can't use it. So if you need that property for whatever reason, you don't have access to it. So those are the cons. Here are the cons for short-term rental. 1, it's a higher entry point, right? When you buy a property to turn it into a short-term rental, you have more costs because you have to get the property furnished, and not just the regular furniture, but you got to get stuff like linen, towels, spoon, cups, all that stuff. Like if you're going to live in it, that's going to be in this this short-term rental, where you don't have that in a long-term rental. Number 2 is management. It is definitely more work to manage a short-term rental. In addition, if you need to hire a management company, because it's more work, it's going to cost you more, right? 3rd is the local laws, regulations, and I'm not a fan of regulations. I really freaking hate them. I think they're business killers. But regulations are an issue in many places. So that's a con with short-term rentals, and you have to constantly be monitoring that. Number 4 is I wrote neighbors. And so here's what I mean by neighbors. If you don't properly manage your property and you start getting, and that property screening your guests, and you start getting bad guests, or you start throwing these ridiculous parties, even though now they're banned on Airbnb, if you don't know that, parties are out, and I'm happy for that, but you will start having problems with your neighbors. And if you have problems with your neighbors, you're going to have problems with the city, because your neighbor's going to be calling the city complaining on you. So neighbors is an issue. And the last is market. Depends on the market you're in, or depend on how successful your short-term rental is. Now, at this stage, Airbnb is extremely popular, and I don't know very few markets where you're not going to make money on short-term rentals. There are some, I'm sure there are, but I personally don't know of any where you're not going to make some kind of money on a short-term rental. If you have any questions as it relates to the pros, either for long-term or short-term rentals, do us a favor and comment below. And more importantly, if you have anything to add, all right, that I didn't list, do that as well so that we can all learn from. In addition to that, same thing with the cons. If you have any questions or you have anything to add, do us a favor and comment below. I hope this information was useful. If it was, do us a big favor and subscribe, like, share, and follow us on Instagram.